guests, I'd like to introduce Adriane Weller. Adriane grew up in Burlington and graduated from Burlington Central High School. She continued her formal education at McGill University, earning a Bachelor of Chemical Engineering with a minor in arts. After some years as a professional life coach, Adriane heard deeper callings and turned toward becoming an end-of-life pregnancy loss, birth and postpartum doula, an end-of-life cycle celebrant, and a yoga teacher. Woven through all of this is her deep passion to support others in living well, knowing all of their available options, understanding their rights, and creating the most meaningful and authentic experiences possible in all aspects and moments of life, including death. As an end-of-life doula, Adriane supports others through advanced planning and preparation, dying and death companionship, family-led death care, natural death care, communication, education, and as an end-of-life celebrant. She is passionate about tending to fear and confusion around dying and death and replacing it with education and choice. Please join me in giving Adriane a very warm virtual welcome to the Haliburton Highlands.
Thank you. Thank you, Terry, and thank you, everyone. I'm so honored to be part of this event this evening. So I will go ahead and share my screen.
Okay, it's up and running.
Okay. So I'm honored to be here tonight to talk about how to plan a green burial. As Terry said, I'm Adriane, and I'm here tonight as an end-of-life doula. Sorry, that function button didn't work. There we go. The Society has also asked me tonight if I would spend a few minutes talking about what is an end-of-life doula, and I'm absolutely delighted to be able to do that. First of all, I want to congratulate the Haliburton Highlands Green Burial Society on arriving here at your first AGM. I know there's lots of energy and effort that's gone into getting here, and I thank you all for your vision and your service to our community. From now on, when I refer to you during the presentation this evening, I'm just going to say the Society. I should probably have found out if you had another brief way of saying this, but that's what I'll use this evening. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge dear Kyle. It's on his life and legacy that this society is built, and he is dearly missed. I was asked to share a little bit about what brings me to this work, and I've always had a calling to work at end of life, and I didn't really know what that would look like. And the death of both of my grandmothers guided me in this. My Nana in particular, who you see here, the universe aligned for us about 10 years ago in her 98th year to be together through her dying hours. And it remains one of the most powerful experiences that I've ever been blessed with, and certainly inspired me to keep moving in this direction. I also want to acknowledge my family, and while this is somewhat dated, this photo, I chose it particularly because this is us on the shores of Halls Lake in the Algonquin Highlands. We had our family cottage here for 45 years, and it was my most special place in the world, so it's more special to be speaking with all of you tonight. It was through a deep curiosity to be able to support my family in all of our planning and thinking ahead and making choices for future health care, future death care, that I really got deeper into this work. As Terry mentioned, I've also had a chapter of my life in life coaching, and this really informs a lot of what I bring to this work. I didn't choose this picture in any way to plug the school that I studied with, but I just loved the fact that it showed the compass. A big part of coaching is helping people find that inner compass. And once they know what is most true and authentic to them, to bring that out for them into the world and through them. And it's really important to me when I work with anyone in this work to find what is most true and meaningful for them and let that be the guide. I also really like this quote by Dr. Ira Byock. There's a deep cultural aversion to talking about dying. There's almost a superstition that if you talk about dying, you're inviting it into your lives. Yet by discussing our wishes for what happens as we approach the end of life, we can drastically increase the chances that our dying will actually play out as we hope. And I find this true of all aspects of end of life, including death care. So my intentions tonight are to offer good knowledge for your minds and hopefully plant some inspiration in your hearts, to answer some existing questions and perhaps inspire some new ones, to provide a foundation of quality resources that will help empower you as you move forward in all of your death care choices. The content will be how to plan a green burial, an overview, a view of the landscape, a possible path, and some helpful guideposts. I'll speak briefly on what is an end-of-life doula, a little bit more about this role and this model of care and how to find us. I'll share a couple of meaningful stories. And as Terry mentioned, I will be leaving you with a resource package, and I'll speak more to some of those resources as we go through. I'd just like to take a moment to bring forth a couple of acknowledgements. I want to acknowledge that end-of-life, illness, and death are sensitive and vulnerable places. I acknowledge that we all bring our own experiences here tonight. Some may be recent or long ago, some very positive or perhaps very challenging, and I honor all of these. I also acknowledge that some of you are probably here with very extensive understanding of this terrain, while others may be here with new curiosity, and I hope that what I offer will be of value to everyone. I want to acknowledge that there will be humor in this presentation, so laughter and tears are equally welcome. And I also want to acknowledge there are images of people through the presentation at end of life, as well as dead bodies in shrouds and caskets. They're gentle, however, they may be uncomfortable, so please take care of yourself as needed. I also like to say at the beginning, I choose not to put any references actually on the screen just to not overcrowd anything. So if there's anything in the presentation at all that you're interested in or curious about, please just contact me after. I'd be happy to share that. So normally when we're all together, I love to take this moment to just interact and dialogue a little bit and find out a little bit more about what might bring you here and what you most hope to learn tonight. So instead, I'll just invite us all to pause for a second and just consider what it is that you'd really like to get out of our time together this evening. I'm really grateful you're all here. How to plan a green burial. This is something we could have a really long conversation about. So in the time I have, I'm going to do my best to impart to you what I feel are some of the most important things to understand. And I also want to say again, this is coming to you through a doula's perspective. So I'm not a funeral service provider, I'm not a cemetery provider, nor am I a medical provider. And I hope that this perspective will perhaps offer something new to things that you may already have learned along the way. So because the focus of this was how to plan, I'm just going to have a very brief overview of green burial tonight. And we'll start with this video. This is from the States, so it does reference that, but the content is equally applicable here. Oh, sorry. There we go.
My name is Sherry Wolf, and I'm the founder of Natural Grace Funerals, and we are a funeral home here covering the Los Angeles area, offering exclusively environmentally friendly death care options for families. Green burial or natural burial, which is often an interchangeable term, is, in its practical sense, a way for us to care for our dead and allowing the body to go back to the earth in a simple, natural fashion with minimal environmental impact. The biggest difference between what we do at Natural Grace and conventional funeral services is that we do not embalm the bodies. So the bodies are kept preserved through refrigeration, and the family still has the option for a private or a public viewing. And this can be incorporated into any kind of funeral service that a family would like to have. So we work with families that have very traditional religious services to very just simple get-togethers, celebrations of life, etc. The three components of a green burial would be an unembalmed body, wrapped either in a shroud or a biodegradable container, and then put directly into the earth. There are basically three different types of burial grounds, coined by the Green Burial Council as being a hybrid, natural, and a conservation. And hybrids are when you have a conventional cemetery, for example, that will set aside an area where they will allow for vaultless burial. They will allow for the decedent to be buried either in a shroud or a very simple biodegradable container. And then, of course, the body is not embalmed. With a natural burial ground, you have a complete natural setting. And for example, as you would look across a natural burial ground, you would not see the large headstones. If there's a marker on top of the grave, then it would be a natural stone from that area. And then the next level of burial ground is conservation. And with those burial grounds, the funds that are put into the burial of that family member go on to actually purchase and preserve more land. Many of the natural burial grounds also allow for family participation, and that may be even as simple as helping to fill back in the grave. And families ask to be part of a natural burial very often. Some of them will even mention that it has been a life-changing event. So to be a part of a natural burial, whether it's a home funeral aspect and to be close to someone that has not been embalmed, or to be out in a natural setting and be participating in a burial, leaves them with a different experience. And as we all know, we are all uncomfortable with death. But somehow, with both of those aspects, people are able to embrace what they are experiencing and actually feel part of it, and feel that they come away with some healing and with some solace.
So as Sherry described, green and natural burial offer us an opportunity to reclaim death care practices that are more natural, instinctive, nourishing, and ecologically sustainable for people, wildlife, and our planet. It's a renewal of ancient practices of caring for our own dead, and they naturally tend to lead to increased re-engagement and participation with death. So in terms of the landscape of green burial, before we get started, there were a couple of things that I wanted to point out that I think are important context. The first is that death care laws are provincially established. And so it matters that we live in Ontario, and it matters that when we come down to kind of the foundational learning, that we understand the framework that we're working within here. Also, it's helpful to know that terminology some is, but there's still a large variation in terminology and how some of these terms are used. So there is a lot of variation. Just keep that in mind as well. I also wanted to speak to this perspective of the continuum. For me, end-of-life care and death care are part of the same and longer continuum that is all of our living and dying experiences. Disposition is but one piece on this continuum, and green burial is but one piece of that. And I think it's very helpful to recognize that choices or events in any one area could be before disposition, during, or after, ripple through the rest. And so sometimes we may feel that we're making choices that are very specific to what's happening, but there could be implications that reach beyond that. And I think that's a helpful perspective to have in our awareness also. And finally, there is no one definition of green burial. And I add this here because what's important to me is to honor our uniqueness within all things, but even within the very perhaps specific lens of green burial. This can mean different things to different people, and it would just be my wish that we find for each of you what is most important and work from that place. So, creating a path. I love this comic, and I feel that it can be mapped over into our thinking about planning a green burial. I mean, it's on the one hand easy to think, oh, this isn't going to be, this is going to be simple. I just want myself wrapped in a shroud and buried in the earth, and hopefully it is that simple and can be that simple. But there are other times where it's not. It's not yet mainstream in our modern death care culture, and sometimes there are a few things we have to navigate and work around in order to secure these wishes and create these visions for ourselves. So I've just come up with a series of steps. They're kind of a bird's eye view. I expect there'll be variations. Some will resonate for some people and others will not. That's perfect. Take what works for you and leave the rest. I have created an overview outline of this as part of the resource package, so you'll be able to refer to it there. So first, it's the opportunity to reflect and just ask ourselves a few questions. What does green burial actually mean to me? Why does it matter to me? Is there something that would make it even more meaningful to me? Are there some things that have happened in my past that might make it more difficult for me? Is there anyone that I think it would be great to have involved with me as I plan this? Any number of things, but just to reflect on what brought you here and what would make this entire experience the most meaningful for you. Next, I think it's so important to become well informed and as far in advance as possible, knowing that you have legally accurate and quality resources. In particular, I do think it's very helpful to have an understanding of Ontario death care laws and rights. The main legislation in Ontario is called the Funeral, Burial, and Cremation Services Act. And while we don't have to read it all, I think it's helpful to know. And I will speak to the organization, the Bereavement Authority of Ontario, that is probably the best and easiest resource, both for aspects of the legislation and knowing what our rights are as consumers in Ontario. It's also helpful to research who your local providers are. For some of us, there will be very little choice, and for others, there will be tremendous choice. Also, to become aware of some quote unquote do-it-yourself options that you may be able to build in. All cemeteries will also have bylaws and price lists that are to be made available. And these can be really helpful, especially when you narrow it down, or if you're looking for specific aspects of a green burial. You can do some research ahead of time by looking through those to get a better idea of what might be possible. Within being well informed, I thought I would take this opportunity to just share a little bit about some of the green hybrid cemeteries in Ontario. Sherry mentioned in the video 3 different classifications. So hybrid, where it's a conventional cemetery that has space set aside for green or natural burial, then natural or standalone cemeteries, and then conservation cemeteries. We also sometimes hear the language green friendly for conventional cemeteries that don't have a specific area set aside, but that will work with families in varying degrees to provide some components of a green burial within their cemetery. So right now in Canada, there are 2 conservation cemeteries. They're both off the west coast of British Columbia on Salt Spring Island and Denman Island. And in Ontario, while there are a number of green-friendly cemeteries, there are, I know anyway, of 8 more hybrid cemeteries. So I just thought I'd show a few pictures of those to give you an idea of where they are also. This is one of the largest hybrid cemeteries in Ontario. This is a woodland cemetery. And their Duffin Meadows Cemetery in Pickering and Meadowvale in Brampton are also identified as offering green burial. There are many more in the works. We know one very close to all of our hearts in the Haliburton Highlands. And I think the Natural Burial Association on their website has a list of 15 or 16 others of places in Ontario that are also currently looking at some kind of green or natural burial option, which is fantastic. There's a list of those 8 with links to their websites in the resource package. So back to additional steps on the path. Considering additional possibilities. The most commonly cited components of green burial, as we know, include direct earth burial in a shroud or biodegradable casket, no grave liner or vault, and no embalming. But what about some other principles and possibilities in green burial that are perhaps not as often talked about, certainly in some of our more conventional spaces? So some things to keep in mind. I have created a list of these and it's part of the resource package. I'll name just a few here to give you an idea. Things like being buried at a shallower grave depth, which is meant to encourage more efficient natural decomposition. Whether or not you might prefer that the grave is opened and or closed by hand and shovel rather than by bigger mechanical equipment. Whether you'd like to adorn a shroud or a casket on the inside or the outside. A big one is also the availability of a winter green burial, which is a significant issue in many parts of our province. Also, if there are people in your community who will have to travel longer distances at the time of your death to be part of any ceremony, keeping in mind what sort of requirements would be needed for your green burial to make that possible for them. Next, I encourage you with the information you've gathered to take some time to really envision, not just about creating a green burial, but creating the green burial that would be most authentic, meaningful, personal, and fulfilling to you. All the elements of what that might look like. Then it'll be time to approach those whose partnership you're going to need. So for sure, a cemetery manager. You may or may not need to speak with funeral providers, and be prepared to have that conversation about what your green burial wishes are and whether or not they will accommodate them. This could require some advocacy on your part, so really using the knowledge and resources that you have. And if you do run into any challenges, seeking out the support of those who can help you work through these pieces and really manifest what's possible. Once that's done and you're aware of what you can create and where and how you'll do that, compile your green burial wishes. Certainly prepare and organize any associated documents and notes that you may have. It'll be very helpful for those who are working with you on this after your death. And some people will choose to prearrange and or prepay with providers, but that's only if desired. It's great to have those conversations with the providers and find what your comfort zone is. Finally, share. I really do believe that sharing your plan with family, friends, community, your executor, or your next of kin, the more people who understand and are aware of what your wishes are and what you may already have prearranged or prepaid for, the more clarity, support, and ease there will be at the time of your death. And this will truly be a gift for everyone. I also believe strongly in regularly reviewing these things. Life circumstances can change for you or for a loved one or someone close to you that could alter your plans. And also new green burial possibilities may become available, whether that's with regards to the actual cemetery or some of the products that you may be, the shrouds, the caskets, whatever that may be. It's great to keep abreast. Things are changing quite quickly these days. I'd like now to offer what I hope will be some helpful guideposts along this path. I think it's important just to understand and really own that green burial often does require pre-thought and planning, a dedication of energy and commitment, a good network of support, and often patience and persistence in the face of industry uncertainty and opposition, both of which are out there, not everywhere, but you may come across it. Some useful facts in this: funeral providers and cemeteries do have the right to refuse caskets or shrouds that an individual would want to bring in on their own. So again, another great reason to have these conversations ahead of time. They don't have to have a really strong reason for it, but they do have the right to refuse them. So that's something you wouldn't want to leave to the last minute. It's also true that sometimes they would suggest there might be a surcharge for you to use your own casket or shroud, and you should not be charged. Also important to know. If you're someone who's already done pre-planning, pre-arranging, prepayment, there are a lot of cases where these things can be changed. I would refer you to the Bereavement Authority of Ontario that I'll speak about in just a moment, and their Guide to Death Care in Ontario. They're great resources to start to understand that, and certainly conversations with providers. Finally, I mentioned this, a bit of a seed to plant. Many of us don't know that it is legal for families in Ontario to not use a funeral provider in caring for their own deceased. And this is referred to as family-led death care. There's often a lot of interplay in when your arrangements were previously made and what kind of arrangements they are, but there should be a way to make changes for you. And I just wanted to plant this seed here because these threads of natural burial and family-led death care intertwine so naturally, as you've already seen. It is legal for families in Ontario to not use a funeral provider in caring for their own deceased. There is a section in the legislation that allows for families to provide after-death care for their own deceased as long as there's no payment involved. And so that's a possibility that a lot of people don't know we are able to do that. So. I'm going to point out a great resource here. As I mentioned before, the Bereavement Authority of Ontario is an organization that was created and mandated by the government a few years ago to oversee and regulate the bereavement sector. And so they're also there to offer consumer protection in all of these realms. On the left, that little booklet, A Guide to Death Care in Ontario, is really helpful to get kind of a quick and summarized overview of a lot of these concepts and rights. And I just wanted to plug on the right side of your screen on page 8 of that little booklet is this wonderful chart the BAO has put together. And it lists, I'm not expecting you to see any of this, I just wanted you to know it was there. It lists the services provided by the type of provider. And it actually has a column there for family of the deceased. So you can also see what the rights are for families. So that's a great way. The BAO also has a website they've recently updated with lots of good information on it. And I've put a few links in the resources for that as well. Another thing I wanted to mention is that there are often significant cost variations in both cemetery and funeral home fees. In fact, I just discovered the BAO put out a notice to consumers early this year advising them to shop around because of the vast differences in prices. And I've linked to that as well. And I thought I'd just, out of curiosity, do a little survey of my own. So this week I contacted 4 of the 8 cemeteries that you recently saw here to check the cost of a single adult grave lot with interment fees. And of those 4 hybrid green cemeteries, it ranged from $2,450 to $5,990. So yes, it can be very different. Another thing that often comes up in conversations about green burial are concerns around safety. So it could be the contamination of waters, the contamination of soil, and also animals digging up natural graves when people are buried just in a shroud. So there's a great article I've linked to by the Green Burial Council called The Science Behind Green and Conventional Burial that I think speaks to that really well in an evidence-based way. Finally, this isn't the evening to speak about these things, but I did just want to bring them up and point to them in this conversation. So there are other disposition alternatives that are sometimes talked about as also being green. Cremation is obviously one we're all aware of. And cremation rates in Canada now are over 70%. So there's a lot of cremation happening. People do often say it's a greener choice. That doesn't always equate to reality. There's another lesser known, but certainly getting more attention now, method of reduction. It's called alkaline hydrolysis. And whereas cremation uses flame, alkaline hydrolysis is based in water reduction. So there's another article I've linked to from the Green Burial Council that talks about the environmental impact of cremation, alkaline hydrolysis, as well as conventional burial. And it's helpful to see that if that's of interest to you. Alkaline hydrolysis is now available at just a few places within our province. The bottom three, as far as I know, are not available in Ontario at this time, but I thought I'd bring them up in case anyone is interested. A lot of you probably have heard of Recompose. They call this, it's less formally known as human composting or natural organic reduction. It actually became legalized in Washington, and I believe they started in December of last year. So bodies are composted, as livestock have been for years, and apparently it results in about 2 wheelbarrows full of fertile soil. There's also the idea of grave reuse or successive burial. As far as I know, this does not happen in Ontario. I'm aware it has been happening in Quebec, and it happens in lots of other places around the world that don't have the blessing and benefit of the kind of land that we have available here in Canada. And finally, grave sharing. I saw an article that this had actually become a practice now out in Vancouver, where instead of having one plot for 1 or 2 bodies of the same, family, or they now offer shared graves. And one of the requirements is that you are buried in a shroud or a biodegradable casket, and you would not know who else was going to be in the same plot. But it obviously allows them to bring more bodies into a smaller area of land, and it also decreases costs and the environmental impact if they're burying that way. So just something else to be aware of. So with regards to the resources, as I've mentioned, I have several links to the Bereavement Authority of Ontario. We're blessed to have the Natural Burial Association here in Ontario, as well as Community Death Care Canada and Green Burial Society of Canada. And then the Green Burial Council, while based in the US, actually considers themselves North American, and they have information about Canadian aspects on their site as well. So those are great resources, and there's lots of links for you. I've also provided links to conversation starters and planning guides. Again, the Natural Burial Association has a couple of great ones to start with. Examples of biodegradable caskets and shrouds, trying to provide some local resources as well, books and films on natural burial, and a few other things. So I hope that'll be really helpful for you. Okay, I'm just going to grab a sip of water. So I'll just spend a couple minutes on what is an end-of-life doula. A common definition nowadays of an end-of-life doula usually sounds something like, well, and first of all, you might hear end-of-life doula or you might hear death doula, because the terminology is not at all standardized. So an end-of-life doula is a continuous presence offering holistic, non-medical support, including physical comfort, emotional, spiritual, and practical support to empower, educate, and build community around a dying person and their family. So doulas offer a variety of services before a person dies, during the active dying process, and following the death. And the services really depend on the unique abilities and interests of the doula, as well as the needs that are being identified by the client and the family. And they're really guided by the values of community-based death care, which encourages individuals and families to take a more participatory role in dying and post-death care practices, which is something that we've heard a lot of in the natural burial realm as well. I thought it would be helpful to provide a bit of context. And so this is a really, really brief overview, but through the past century, as we've seen the institutionalization of medicine, the medicalization of death, and the professionalization of funeral practices, it's led us to be further and further separated from traditional and community-based dying and death care practices. And so many of you are probably familiar with birth doulas. This term seems to have kind of been coined in the early 1970s for women who support and companion women and families through pregnancy and birth and postpartum. There's now a solid evidence base with many recognized benefits of having a doula present. So in terms of death doulas, it appears that this language and role kind of came about in the early to late 90s. And nowadays, as we have this awareness of the complexity of the modern issues in death care, doulas are helping, to bridge these gaps in unmet needs that individuals and families are facing. And in doing so, they're changing the way that end-of-life care and death care are delivered. And I heard a phrase recently that doulas are like the water running between the rocks of end-of-life care and death care. And in my experience, that really speaks to the fluidity of the role and the way it can weave through so many aspects of these two systems. So this is but one example, but I thought I'd bring it up to provide some insight as a model of care, a doula model of care. So what are the guiding principles? Well, it's all non-medical support. Doulas are non-medical professionals. And if they are also medical professionals, different scope of practice, different hat on. It's holistic care. It's non-judgmental support. So we're objective and neutral companions along the path. It's a family-centered approach. We work through education, supporting advocacy to empower individuals and families to find the way and make the choices that are best for them. And we're also very happy to work as team members and collaborate with others who are involved with the family and the individual as per the wishes of the family. I think another big piece about the doula model of care is the continuity of care. And because there are so many different ways and so many different times along that continuum that the doula may have a role, depending on the family and the needs, there's the possibility to be involved for a really long time. And it provides one person that is consistent for that individual and family, while so many others will come and go at different times along that spectrum. So I would say the foundational role of a death doula is someone who companions and walks alongside and supports families through illness, dying, and death, and beyond death. And I feel that the emerging role in that is that doulas are starting to work sort of further on either side of that spectrum. So many of them will offer private, highly personalized, community-based services. And this can include things like just starting to have conversations about death. It can include advanced preparations such as future health care, advanced care planning, death care, thinking through all of these things far, far, far in advance. Better understanding options in end-of-life care, having support in navigating through the medical system, companionship, respite care. There may be an interest in doing some legacy work, life reviews. People may just want a better understanding of the dying process and what to expect. Sitting vigil through the dying time, through death, and a lot of education at all parts of the spectrum. Some doulas will also be trained as home funeral guides and or funeral celebrants. So there's a lot of diversity depending on the interests and the training of each individual doula. And there's a lot of diversity in education too. It's currently not a regulated profession. And so it's very individual, which I think makes it very exciting and also very hard to specifically define. So some people talk about doulas being part of this movement that's underway to support and promote cultural change around death care, to bring it out of being hidden for so long and start bringing it back out into the open again, to normalize death in our communities, to assist in creating more participatory roles in the dying experience, to work collaboratively within existing resources and systems to improve end-of-life care, and to again reclaim these traditional ways of and transform how we die. Death used to be in the family, in the home, in the community, and it's really once again, just like natural burial, returning to those ways. So for me, an end-of-life doula is someone who's completely comfortable with death, a very loving, compassionate, and unbiased presence, who works from a heart-centered and family-centered place, supporting holistic care of body, mind, and soul before, during, and after death, and is comfortable from the practical to the spiritual, is aware of many of the challenges in modern end-of-life and death care and can help to demystify and navigate these, is an informed and gentle educator, understands and listens deeply, and is truly your partner in realizing what is most meaningful and important for you through your life, dying, and death. And again, doulas have this capacity, depending on the desires of the individual or family, to be involved for very little periods of time with a very specific role, or across a much longer period of time with a wide variety of roles. So again, there is a section in your resource package about end-of-life doulas. And in terms of where to find us, I will say, in my experience, most doulas are still practicing independently. So please consider just doing an end-of-life doula, death doula, thana doula search in your local area and see who comes up. I have also provided links to 3 organizations in Canada that do have directory listings as well, and a few other resources there too. So I'd like to move on to share a couple of stories that I find useful and also inspiring. So this is Frank, and Frank is actually my uncle, and he's still alive. Frank has Scottish roots that are very important to him. And so he wanted to do some pre-planning, and he knew which cemetery he wanted to be in because that's where his mother was. So we went over and started to take a look around and ask some questions and gather some information. And as we were working with the pre-planner, she said to my uncle, you know, the policy of the cemetery, this particular cemetery, was that you could only, sorry, my uncle has chosen cremation, that's his choice. So you could only use an urn if you purchased it from their cemetery. And the cheapest one was $600, and the look of it was nothing that my uncle would have been interested in. So we had talked previously, because I am who I am, about the fact that, you know, sometimes people have personal objects that they're able to use as an urn. And so it's my uncle's wish to have a niche, so a small space inside the cemetery building where his ashes will be placed. And so we asked this pre-planner, we said, you know, my uncle has this Scottish cookie tin that he really loves, and it's big enough and it has a good fitting lid, and, you know, he would really like to be able to use that. Is that possible? And so she kind of looked at us a little different. She said, I don't know, I've never heard of that. And she said, I'll go ask. So she came back a few minutes later and she said, I'm sorry, that's just not possible. You'll have to use one of ours. So we said, okay, and we got the information we wanted and we went home. So I took a look at the cemetery bylaws and I read through them, and Frank and I talked some more, and we decided that I would make an appointment to go back and see the cemetery manager and explain Frank's interest and what I'd read in the bylaws, and see what happened. And so I did that, and in the end, the cemetery manager simply said, yep, that'll be fine. I had brought the tin in to show him, and he just asked Frank to sign a waiver of consent that he was bringing in his own urn, which Frank was more than happy to do. And he now has permission from the cemetery to use his Scottish cookie tin as his urn when he dies. And so this has actually brought him a tremendous amount of joy to know that this is the choice that he'll be able to make. So, you know, the first answer was no, but we did our due diligence research and went back and booked a conversation, and it was no problem at all. Oh, this next story I'm going to share is with full permission from the family, and it's a really powerful story, I think, and relates absolutely directly to green and natural burial. So this is Kirk, and I was introduced to his family and his wife, Julie, through a member of our Haliburton Highlands community, actually, at the time of Kirk's death. And this was an unexpected death. Kirk died by suicide. So it was very traumatic for the family and for the community, and completely unexpected. It was on December 28th, so it's deep winter. It happened to be on a weekend. It was between Christmas and New Year's. And it was Kirk and Julie had talked much about what their kind of dying wishes would be, but had never thought to make any arrangements or, get any specific details about it. And so all Julie knew was that it was absolutely essential that Kirk have the absolute greenest burial possible. I have a lot of notes here that Julie and her community shared with me about what they were able to accomplish for Kirk. And I was honored to be able to work with them through those days. The family lived in Thunder Bay at the time, where Julie still lives. However, they have a lot of family in Hamilton. And Julie felt it would be best for Kirk to be buried in Hamilton. So through the support of an incredible community, a very collaborative funeral home, and a wonderfully responsive and collaborative cemetery in Hamilton, which is a conventional cemetery, not a hybrid, but obviously we're willing to work with Julie on this. They created an exceptional green burial for Kirk, and especially under such circumstances. So I tried to narrow this down, all these points about how they had managed to do this, and there's very little I felt I could leave out. So I hope that this will help bring to light what can be possible, and what happens when a bunch of committed people and a deep loving and earth loving spirit are all working together on this. So Julie and friends write that they made Kirk's burial green by finding a site with no pesticides that accommodates wild weeds in its lawns. Kirk was buried with no vault. A tree was to be planted by his foot, which you can now see in the photo it has been. And the cemetery invited the family to attend. They had permission to plant another tree or anything in a local area. They also had a large flower bed in which they were invited to gift plants in his name if they chose to do so in collaboration with the cemetery. They were able to purchase a double depth lot, so Julie will be buried on top of Kirk. And she figures that means they'll take up about as much space as if they were each buried standing up together, which was what Kirk had originally wished. As you can see, there's no headstone, but they did have permission to add a smaller natural stone that they could get engraved or paint upon if they chose. They call Kirk's casket his box. It was 100% Canadian poplar, only a little composting organic glue, but mostly joinery and no metal. In it, he was wrapped in the hemp shower curtain from their last house, set on sawdust from a neighbor's sawmill, over an organic mulching fabric donated by a local farm, covered in a 100% cotton organic blanket. On his chest inside his box was a bouquet of local cedar boughs and some other local winter greenery made by a friend, and a granite stone gifted by a friend that is shaped like a heart. On his box, buried with him, was the image that you'll see on the right here, made by a family friend representing what Kirk was all about. It was etched onto a piece of pine and then screened onto a piece of canvas. And another copy of this was put onto the cover of the guest book, which guests at his visitation signed and wrote messages to the family in. His injuries from his death and his autopsy were not repaired. There was no embalming, but he was, quote unquote, cleaned up and set out in his box so the family could spend time with his body on 2 occasions. He was transported by his family, so Julie and their daughters and Julie's brother and her cousin, in the bed of a double cab pickup truck from Thunder Bay to Hamilton in a single 23-hour drive. Temperatures were below 0 the whole way, but they had ice all around his box just in case. Recycling that can be recycled in Hamilton but not in Thunder Bay was also tucked in around him, fittingly enough. The Whalens always collect this recycling until they can bring it down to Southern Ontario, so of course they took this opportunity. Friends helped lift Kirk's box into the truck for the trip, and friends and family met them at the cemetery upon their arrival in Hamilton to move his box from the truck bed into position over the prepared grave. The earth was left beside Kirk's grave with half a dozen shovels, and staff were there to lower Kirk's box and then move their lowering gear out of the way once the family was ready. And family and friends were welcome to bury his box as much and as long as they wished. That story still moves me to tears. Because, oh, well, for so many reasons, but in large part because of the emotion and expression and conversations that I've had with Julie then and over time and since, including when I asked permission to share this story with you tonight, which she was more than happy to do because she knew Kirk would want this to be part of his legacy to inspire others in these possibilities too. Julie has written, "It feels as if I could write every cliche in the book and they would all hold true. Thank you isn't big enough. Thank you fails to cover how my heart had many healing moments, knowing that I was able to accomplish all of Kirk's wishes. My heart's healing moments were because of this." And so stories like this just solidify for me more and more the healing that's available in the toughest of circumstances when we're able to authentically care for our loved ones through these parts of their death. So my heart out to Julie and family and Kirk, and thanking them for the opportunity to share this story tonight. So coming to a close here, the words of another dear colleague of mine, Rochelle, just the power of choosing in death what we value in life and how that brings so much meaning and healing for ourselves and for others and for our planet. I'd like to close tonight by reading a quote from this wonderful book called Reimagining Death by Lucinda Herring. It's Lucinda in this photo. And I just feel it so speaks to everything we've been speaking about tonight. When we physically lower a corpse into a grave ourselves and feel its weight and stillness, we have a felt sense of what it means to be dead. When we contemplate the depth of the grave in terms of how rapidly our loved one will decompose, such efficiency an actual goal rather than something we're trying to prevent, we come up close to the stark reality of what happens to our bodies after death. There is no way that we can avoid this encounter. It gives us a direct experience of truth, what simply is and will be for all of us. Such experience is a powerful gift, a reckoning and a return. When we creatively engage in rituals and ceremonies that give something back to nature, there is often a tangible sense of wholeness and completion, and a kind of peace that seems to come from the earth itself and the cyclical webs of life welcoming our loved one home. Such experience can be a potent remedy for the fear, avoidance, and denial so many of us carry about death today. So thank you all so much for being here with us tonight and for the opportunity to be here with you.
So I want to thank you, Adriane, for that wonderful presentation. I think it touched many, many people that are here. I want to also ask just briefly to people about whether or not anybody experienced a power outage at all. I know I did, and it took about 10 minutes to get back on stream. I hope that that nothing interrupted the presentation while it was happening. I take it that it didn't. And that, but it may have interrupted the recording process, and I need to, I guess, pay some attention to that while we do the editing afterwards. But I want to thank you, Adriane, for that wonderful presentation. We now have a few minutes for some questions and answers, and for comments to be placed into the chat function. So I invite you to do that. I wanted to start with, I guess it's an invitation for you to comment, Adriane, on the role of a doula in palliative care and in MAID, that is medically assisted death.
Sure, thanks. That's a wonderful question. Personally, I feel there's a ton of potential there. Um, my experience is that we have, on the one hand, some tremendous palliative care in our country, and we're very fortunate for that. I'm also aware of the reality that these services just aren't available to all Canadians, and so there are a lot of people who aren't able to receive the fullness of those resources. And I know that I can speak for in the US, there's become quite an active movement of collaboration between end-of-life doulas, or growing, I should say, growing collaboration between end-of-life doulas and hospices and more palliative care related organizations. So I'm not aware of, I don't know how much of that is happening in Canada at this time. I am not aware of any end-of-life doulas that work with hospice, but I don't know all the end-of-life doulas by any stretch. My attempts to reach out to my local hospice have not been received with a sense of openness and curiosity to this point. But certainly I think because all systems seem to be stretched and overwhelmed, and this concept of the doula being able to provide, in terms of hospice, there would be potentially some overlap of roles, but there's also places where the doula can come in that's a little bit different. With regards to MAID specifically, I again feel that there's tremendous opportunity for end-of-life doulas to support individuals and families choosing MAID. It's such a different experience of, well, for some, every MAID experience is different, but to have a schedule on our death is something that we as a culture are still adjusting to. And I think there's tremendous opportunity for a doula to be involved in working with families in that sort of emerging reality in Canada, as well as just in all the regular ways of supporting families through preparation for end of life.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I wonder if you could take your screen down so we could actually maybe reconnect with everybody who's here. I think I'm going to put my gallery view on to see the cast of thousands. That's great. So one other question that occurs to me, and I encourage people to put any comments or questions in the chat box, but seeing none at the moment, I take this opportunity to ask you about winter burial. From your story with regard to Kirk, he died in the winter, and that obviously is a problem in our neck of the woods. In Haliburton, there is no winter burial from about freeze up in November through to thaw in May. And I just was curious about what your experience has been in trying to encourage winter burial in circumstances where you're dealing with a variety of cemeteries.
Sure. I actually think you would be much more well suited to answer that question. But in my limited experience of this, in the one experience with Kirk, obviously that cemetery was immediately able to make it happen, and it was deep winter here in Hamilton area at that time. As we know, the other experience I've shared with your family was in the Highlands, and the fact that that wasn't possible in the end to make that happen. So I'm aware, it sounds to me like there are cemeteries in various places that will make it possible, and others that still are, that's not a priority or an interest. And I don't have any more detailed understanding of, what numbers of cemeteries may be where with that. But it's certainly, I appreciate and honor your advocacy on that, because it's a huge length of time, our winters, where this possibility is at the moment largely unavailable.
Okay, there's a question in the chat box about the fact that you had a cottage up here. You probably you don't anymore, but do you still provide end-of-life doula services in Haliburton County?
Yes, I will be. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Any other comments or questions anybody wants to put forward? Put into the chat function.
Terry, I see a couple questions here. Maybe they got lost when you had to power out.
Okay,
So there's
perfect.
one from Susan about can one build their own box? And so in theory, Susan, yes. Certainly many people choose to do that. Again, you would just want to be sure that it's very well built and that there is conversation in advance, ideally, with which cemetery you would be choosing to make sure that they would accept the one that you've built. There are, I'm sure if you were to go online, there are got idea not what's the word I'm looking for, examples of, perhaps even, patterns or tips, or you may have, people in your community completely capable of doing that already. So yes, in many circumstances, people are able to do that if the providers will accept it.
Okay, so I may have missed other ones because of the power shortage. Do you see anything else in your chat box that I don't have?
Yeah, let me see. There's a question, are there natural specialists, as in the video, funeral providers in Ontario? Are there funeral providers who specialize in natural burial? That's a fabulous question, and to be honest, I don't know. I've heard of different funeral homes that seem to be more green friendly, but that's not something that I have in-depth knowledge of, and it would be great to know and to be able to catalog that.
Okay, there's a question in my chat box about whether or not your resources are going to be made available. And I just wanted to say to people that we'll be sending that out to everybody who was registered for tonight's meeting. That will go to everybody by email as soon as we can get it together. We were planning to do that at the same time as making the recording of tonight's meeting available. But given the glitch with respect to the power outage, I'm not sure that the editing process is going to be as fast as I envisaged. And so we may have to send them out separately, but we'll get it out to you really quickly. It's also a chance for me to give a commercial about our website. There is a resources section on the website. And to the extent that Adriane is providing materials that augment that, we will be integrating that into the resource section on the Haliburton Highlands Green Burial website as well. And so I'll invite you to take a look at that. You'll see something about that if you stick around for the AGM. This is a commercial. You'll hear more about our website.
There's another one here.
Can you see anything else that's available in the chat? I know that there was somebody who asked about animal interference with respect to shallow graves. You want to speak a little bit about that?
Sure. So Mary, you mentioned the possibility of animal interference. Does this occur with a more shallow grave? Does it occur much at all? I again would refer all of you to the article from the Green Burial Council, which is much more informed than I am. But my short answer to that would be, from what I've learned and read and heard, generally it's not an issue, although I think many of us think it naturally could be. Apparently for animals, there's a smell barrier of about 2 feet. And so normally if anything is buried deeper than that, most won't smell it. And for green burial, it's usually recommended that the depth is between 3 to 4 feet, and conventional burial is usually closer to 5 or 6 feet. And that can change if it's a double grave. There's also, I remember Mark Richardson, the cemetery manager of Willow's Rest in Fairview Cemetery in Niagara, mentioning once that I think the biggest problem they had was badgers like digging around the monuments in the cemetery. So my understanding is that no one had any stories of when this had happened, and so it's not usually considered a concern. Okay. There's another question here, Terry, from Carolyn, around how do we organize a circle of friends or kindred spirits to be there for end of life? And this is such a great question, Carolyn, and I think the place to start is to start having conversations with the people, opening conversations, seeing if there's a willingness to open a conversation with the people that you feel are those kindred spirits to you. And if you feel like you don't necessarily have kindred spirits who are open to those conversations, then certainly looking at ways within the community to make some more of those connections. There are, for lack of a better word, programs or guides for creating such circles in communities. If that was something you were interested in, I'd dig a little deeper to find those for you. That might help. But really, it is exactly what you're saying, bringing this back to our own lives, to our own communities, making those connections, educating and empowering ourselves together to be there for each other. There's a woman in the United States, Jerry Grace Lyons, who is now considered one of the mothers of the home funeral the recent home funeral movement in the US. And, it was a friend of hers and the experience they went through in their community that got her into this to begin with. And so it very much does happen that way. If you'd like to have any further conversation about it at any time, please feel free to reach out.
Okay, it's now getting on to 8:45, and so I'm feeling a little bit of heat with respect to moving on to the AGM portion and not keeping people too long tonight. But what I guess I would like to do is to say to people that you're welcome to continue to send us questions. There's a comment and question section on our website. You could also send us an email at greenburialsociety@gmail.com. And that will, what we'll do is undertake, if you have a question and we don't readily have the answer to it, we'll crowdsource an answer for you, including talking to Adriane about it and see whether or not she's got anything that she could send to you. So it's not the end of being able to ask questions. It's actually the beginning of a process where you can engage with the society and others to ask questions and get your questions dealt with. So please, we're extending an open invitation to you. Any and all questions are welcome. And you can just put a comment or question into our comment section on our website. So I'm going to call an end to this part of the meeting and thank Adriane for a wonderful presentation and your answers in the question period. And we will undertake to get a video of this up on our YouTube channel as soon as we possibly can. Thank you for this.